am so thrilled to be here. Here's your book, love. I woke up this morning in your gorgeous, gorgeous city, town, and I had a choice between good hair and a walk on the beach, and I chose a walk on the beach. So forgive the wind-blown look. All right, today we're going to talk a lot a bit about the most fiery, wonderful woman named Joy Davidman. And I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions, so y'all please think about what you want to ask. Think about what you want to talk about, but I'm going to introduce her to you. So in the 1940s, Joy Davidman wrote an essay titled On Fear. And in that essay, she asked this question: if we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us? I love that question. If we should grow brave, what on earth would become of us? She didn't say if we are brave, if someday. She says if we should grow brave. And then she answered that question, not with a lecture, not with a talk, but with her life. So she set out to answer that question, and in doing so, she changed her life, her heart, her family, and then the life and the heart and the work of one of our most beloved authors of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis. If we've read C.S. Lewis, we all fall into our own kind of love with C.S. Lewis. I fell into mine when I was about 11 years old, and I read the Screwtape Letters. I'm a preacher's daughter, and I probably shouldn't have read the Screwtape Letters when I was 11 years old. But it was in the library, and I believed Satan was following me everywhere, and that I had my own wormwood following me around. And then I fell through the wardrobe door of Narnia. So I have always loved C.S. Lewis, but he only loved one woman enough to marry, and it was late in life, and her name was Joy Davidman. Her name was Helen Joy Davidman, called Joy. His name is C.S. Lewis, called Jack. And their decade-long relationship led to one of the greatest love stories and improbable love stories of our time, spurring gossip, novels, movies, essays, people always wondering about how this happened. I have always been fascinated with improbable love stories. All 13 of my novels have in some way dealt with the vagaries of love. But I'm not interested in the prince saving the princess. I am not interested in the white horse saving the woman in the tower. And Joy is anything but a princess in need of saving. Joy was a fiery woman who heard the cry of her own soul and made a courageous journey from New York to London to Oxford, back to New York, back to London, back to Oxford. So why is Joy most often remembered, if she is remembered at all? How many of you here have heard of Joy Davidman before today? Okay, how many haven't? Whoa! I am so thrilled to introduce you to Joy Davidman. So why is Joy most often remembered, if she's remembered at all, as the dying wife of C.S. Lewis? You know, she's often portrayed, if we know the movie Shadowlands or some of the books written about her, as the woman who died well. Well, maybe because it's easier to remember women as the adjunct to the man. Maybe it's easier to put us in a box instead of looking at the complicated and courageous woman she really is and was. So when she passed away, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called A Grief Observed, one of the greatest books on grief ever written. And if you read this book, he actually wrote it under a nom de plume, N.W. Clerk, at first, because he was teaching at Cambridge by that time, and he didn't want people to know of his great grief and how much he was struggling with his faith and how much he was struggling with the grief and how it was laying him low. So when I read this book, I wanted to know about this woman. He was obviously madly connected to her and in love with her. And I asked, who was this poet and novelist who so enchanted Lewis that it almost destroyed his faith? Here's who she was. Joy was a brilliant woman, an award-winning poet, a prodigy. She graduated from high school at 14 years old, from Columbia Graduate School at 19 years old. She was a novelist, a critic, a screenwriter. She was also an ex-atheist, a reformed Jew, and a former communist. She was also married with 2 children and living in upstate New York. If there was ever an improbable love story, it was this. He was an Oxford Don who lived across the ocean. He was the tutor of English literature at Magdalen College at Oxford University. There could not have been a more improbable love story until it wasn't. What happened was that Joy was married and living in upstate New York, married to another novelist. His name was Bill Gresham. And she had a mystical, what she described as a mystical experience. Bill had been in the Spanish Civil War and had a lot of what we would now call PTSD. And he had a nervous breakdown one night, and he called her and said he wasn't coming home. She had 2 young sons, and she found herself on her knees. And she didn't understand why she was on her knees, because she was an atheist. And she had a mystical experience. And some of the ways she described it is that her ego cracked, that God came in, that she said that she realized she was not in control of her life. And it was the first time she realized she wasn't in control of her life. She said it was like waking up. She said it only lasted 30 seconds, but it was like waking up and realizing that all of her life, she had taken life watered down and diluted by space and time. She said she realized how much energy she had spent keeping God out. And she called herself the world's most astonished atheist. Years later, when C.S. Lewis wrote Surprised by Joy, which is his biography, he said he was the world's most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. So you can start to see their parallel paths, how they influenced each other. But at this point, they've never heard of one another. For Joy, mystical equaled experiential, which means that she had experienced God. And for the first time in this intellectual woman's life, experience trumped logic. This is one of my favorite quotes by her. Life is so intense, it can't forever be endured with logic. So this was her breaking point, but she didn't realize that she was ready for this breaking point. All of her life, Joy had been searching for something more. All of her life, in her poetry, in her writings, in her seeking, in her recklessness, she had been searching for something more. She had been searching for something that satisfied her intellect, her logic, and her heart. And she finally found it. Once she was an atheist, she wrote a poem called Resurrection, in which she argued with Jesus about his resurrection. So she was ready for this breakthrough. So let's meet a little bit about Joy. Here's one thing she said. If the knowledge of God is true, then the thinking of my whole life has been false. And this is where her transformation began. So the story gets even better now, because what she did in this search is she wrote to a man named C.S. Lewis, who lived across the ocean. She wrote to him asking him questions that she felt she needed answering. And this started a 3-year pen friendship. So for 3 years, all they did was write to one another, talking about the big questions in life, talking about theology. She wanted to understand. She wanted to find something that answered her questions. She wanted to live in the mystery. Finally, in August of 1952, she sailed to England. She sailed for a lot of reasons that you'll read about in the book, but then she finally met her friend Jack. And this is where the story gets really good. Not because it's easy, not because it gets better for her, but because they have so many obstacles to overcome. They finally meet, and their decade-long love story contributed to some of Lewis's greatest works on faith, on love, on the four loves, on the Psalms, on the true self behind the veil, on grief. Yet Joy is rarely acknowledged. Rarely. Look how many hands went up that don't know her. She's rarely acknowledged for the muse, the best friend, the love of his life, the woman he called my whole world, earth, star, air, and water. She was a co-author on a couple of his novels, most explicitly Till We Have Faces, which is my favorite. And I think it's Jodi's favorite too, right? I lost Jodi. So let's stop talking about the woman behind the man, okay? Can I get an amen? Let's start talking about the woman beside the man, and that is Joy Davidman. So Joy came to me when I was kind of a dead end in my writing, when I didn't know what I wanted to write next. And a friend of mine asked the question that I think all of us, as friends of each other, need to ask each other. And that's, what would you write about, or what would you do if you could do anything you wanted? What is your soul crying out to do? And then don't give me the excuses why you can't. And so a friend of mine asked me, I was at a Christmas party with a group of my writer friends, and a woman named Ariel Lawhon, you should read her books, who was a historical novelist, asked me, what would you write about if you could write about anything you wanted? And I said, I would write about Joy Davidman, C.S. Lewis's wife, but I don't write historical fiction. And she looked at me and she said, well, if you don't do that, I am. I said, I'm doing it. I've got this. I've got this. We're writing this. And from that moment, Joy and I were a team. And I dove in the deep end of research, and I found two conflicting storylines about Joy. There were those who thought Joy was an abrasive woman who inserted herself into Lewis's life. Then there were those who thought she was the brilliant intellectual who was finally C.S. Lewis's equal, and that enchanted him. And I wanted to know, which woman was she? Who was this really? So I decided not to listen anymore what people said about her, which is kind of what we should do in real life. And I decided to listen from her. I decided to ask the question that I ask of my fictional characters. What does she want? Why can't she get it? What are the psychological and spiritual misbeliefs she has that keeps her from living her better life? And then I read her words, and luckily we have them. Her letters are published, her essays are published, her novels are published, her poetry is published. Then in the Wade Center in Chicago at Wheaton are her unpublished letters and unpublished poetry. And I wrote the novel by reading from her. So this novel is told in the first-person point of view, and it is told from behind her eyes. So let me tell you a teeny bit about her. In April of 1915, Joy Davidman was born 16 and a half years after C.S. Lewis. She was born to two immigrant parents from Russia and Poland. She grew up in the Jewish ghetto of New York in the Bronx. She was raised with a very harsh environment where acclamation and assimilation were the gods to which her family bowed. They grew up with a Jewish heritage, but not a Jewish belief. When she was 9 years old, she was brilliant, a prodigy. Her parents didn't know what to do with her half the time. Probably what today we would call the strong-willed child. That would be Joy. When she was 9 years old, she read a book by H.G. Wells titled The History of the World. She marched into her living room and she pronounced to her parents that she was an atheist. And they were appalled, and she was thrilled that they were appalled. So that tells you everything you should know about Joy Davidman. And yet, she was also a child completely enthralled by nature. Her very first poetry is about nature and its influence on her, and how nature always made her feel there was something more, something mystical in the world. But she believed that mystery and that mystical world only existed in literature and in imagination and in dreams. She always had very vivid dreams. She had a dream all of her childhood of walking towards a castle and almost getting there, but never quite. Then she read C.S. Lewis's The Pilgrim's Regress, and it was as if her dream had showed up in a book. You'll learn all these little connections in the novel. So, like I said, she graduated from high school at 14, graduate school at 19. She won the Yale Younger Poets Award when she was in her 20s. She was taken on by Brant & Brant, which was one of the biggest agencies in New York at the time. She was part of the New York literati, novelist. She had 2 novels out. But she lived in an age where women were silenced and shamed for stepping outside the house, for their jobs, for personal satisfaction. And this is where she becomes our metaphor. This is where joy, seeming of little time or value in our world today, becomes somebody we can learn from. Sorry, I touched the microphone. Becomes somebody that we can learn from. Because Joy spent most of her life asking if there was something more. She said, show me if there is something more. So she ended up moving to England with her children. But we might not need to pack up our families. We might not need to pack up our children and get on a ship and move across the ocean, but we might need to pack up everybody else's expectations of us, everybody else's demands of us that aren't God's calling for us. So that's what she did. She packed up society's expectations and she moved. For a long while, for her whole life, Joy was told who and how to be. And she was having none of it. As a child, it earned her slaps across the face. As an adolescent, it earned her harsh criticism and ostracization. As a married woman, it made her tolerate verbal abuse, philandering, and alcoholism until she couldn't and until she didn't. And that's where she has so much to tell us today. When we look at her circumstances and we pen the bullet points of her life, how can we say her life was better? Because honestly, there were a lot of really tough times. Life didn't get easier because she trusted, but that's where trust hits the rubble for Joy. So Joy lived long before one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver, who wrote a poem called The Journey. And in that poem, she has this line, determined to save the only life you can save, which is your own, which is what Joy did. So what lessons does she have for us today? What can we learn from Joy? What messages does her improbable love story have for us as women? As I was writing this novel, there were times I wanted to reach through the pages and shake her. What are you doing? Step out. Stop. Can't you see this is killing you? And then by the time I was finished, she was doing the opposite. She was stepping out of the pages to teach me. So I'm going to tell you a few of the kind of more profound things I felt like she was teaching me and us. The first is trust, what we might call intuition, or what we might call the soft whisper of God. Trust yourself in God, trust your intuition, I wanted to say to her and shake her, as she believed the doctors when they told her that the lump in her breast, which eventually caused her death, was nothing but a cyst. When her husband told her to stay home and tolerate his infidelity and abuse. But then she turned around and said to me, trust yourself and your intuition, she says to all of us, when she climbs aboard the SS United States and pursues life and health against the odds. Second, individuality. Seeking approval is crippling to our lives. We know that, right? Amen? Seeking approval is crippling to our lives. When she was staying in the situation that wasn't healthy, I wanted to reach through the pages and say, it is okay to be different than the women around you. We are all created in the Maker's image with our own journey, I wanted to say to her, as she tried so desperately to be just like her neighbors. Pleasing others and her parents and her husband desperately is crippling your life, I wanted to tell her. Then she turned around and said, it's okay to be different than the women around you. We are all created in the Maker's image with our own journey, she says, as she lives in a third-floor walk-up in London, shivering and broke and working in a basement doing publishing, but believing she was stitched together by her Maker's hand and would find her way. Number 3, shame. Don't carry around the shame your parents gave you, I wanted to tell her, as she attempted to overcome the constant need for assimilation and achievement to prove her worth, while she was being called names like abrasive and brash. Then she turned around and said, don't anymore carry the shame given to you, she tells us as she writes her poetry and her novels, as she hikes through the great fields of Oxford with C.S. Lewis, falling in love. Abuse. Leave your abusive husband the first time you thought about it, I wanted to tell her. His personality disorder is destroying you and your sons. You are never commanded to stay in any kind of abuse. Then she turned around. Leave any kind of abuse the first time, she tells us, as she lives in a seaside shack with other women, sharing a kitchen and waiting for the next phase of her life to start. Staying, she tells us, by her actions, tears away at your self-esteem. And no matter how much you think you can fix it by being the good wife and mother, you can't fix it. We leave even though we're scared. Courage and strength can be mixed together with fear. Acquiescing to society. This is what I wanted to tell her. Each time you acquiesce to something you know you should not, you hide your true self and cause your soul great damage. I wanted to tell her as she tried one more time to abide her husband's infidelities. Each time she turned around and said, you acquiesce to something you know you should not, you hide your true self and cause your soul great damage, she told us as she refused to return home and allow Bill to take her boys back to America. Obsessive love. I don't know, I might know about that. Your obsessive love for men will not gain lasting love, I wanted to tell her. And then she turned around and tells us, your obsessive love will not bring lasting love. She tells all of us as she discovers the love of self through God and realized that the approval and love she was seeking was inside, in her connection to the divine. She finds true eros with C.S. Lewis, a man who sees her for who she is, not as she is judged to be by the Society of Oxford, as she co-writes and creates with him. Health. Your health is failing, I wanted to tell her. It is failing because cancer is spreading through your body as you believe the doctors who are telling you something wrong. Then she turns around and tells us, your health is worth pursuing with everything you have. She tells us that she is dying from metastasis. Denying your own self-care does no one any good at all. You must be your own advocate. Defining the self. I wanted to reach in and say your foibles and sins of the past, of which she had many, of which I do too, does not determine who you are today. I wanted to tell her as she wept in anger at her own brokenness. Then she turns around and says, your foibles and sins of the past do not determine who you are today and will lead you forward. It is your brokenness that brings you to the light, she tells us as she stands in St. Paul's bell tower and accepts that her life is changing drastically. Imperfection. You must hold your imperfection and your perfection together, I wanted to tell her as she strove to be perfect, as she strove to achieve and win. She turned around and said, you must hold your imperfection and your perfection together in what Thomas Merton calls a hidden wholeness, as she builds a new life in England and pursues her art and her passion. Your creative life. She struggled greatly with walking the line between her creative life and being a mother. Pursue your writing and poetry, I wanted to tell her, even as she took a job in a dingy basement to pay for her food and lodging. Pursue your passions and creative life, she tells us today. It is how we are meant to co-create and express ourselves in the world. Don't stop ever for anyone or anything. So what Joy does, and there are more, but what Joy does is speak to us not in sermons, not in lectures, but by the way she lived her life. Love, she shows us, is worth the convoluted and complicated path of changing our life and transforming our life. Faith, she shows us, is worth the convoluted and complicated path of transforming our life. So I'm going to read just a teeny bit, or maybe I'm not because there's no book up here. Does someone have a book? Where'd it go? I'll read from the very beginning, and then we're going to take some questions. So think about what you want to ask me. I'm going to read just the very beginning because I think it's going to introduce you to the woman that she is. Thank you, Mary Linda. From the very beginning, it was the great lion who brought us together. I see that now. The fierce and tender beast drew us to each other slowly, inexorably, across time, beyond an ocean, and against the obdurate bulwarks of our lives. He wouldn't make it easy for us. That's not his way. It was the summer of 1926, and my little brother Howie was 7 years old, and I was 11. I knelt next to his bed and gently shook his shoulder. Let's go, I whispered. They're asleep now. That day I'd come home with my report card, and among the long column of A's, there was the indelible stamp of a B denting the cotton paper. Father. I'd tapped his shoulder, and he'd glanced away from the papers he was grading, his red pencil marking students' work. Here's my report card. His eyes scanned the card, the glasses perched on the end of his nose as an echo of the photos of his Ukrainian ancestors. He'd arrived in America as a child, and at Ellis Island he's changed his name from Yosef to Joseph. He stood now to face me and lifted his hand. I could have backed away. I knew what came next in a family where assimilation and achievement were the priorities. His open palm flew across the space between us, a space brimming with my shimmering expectation of acceptance and praise. And he slapped my left cheek with the clasp of skin on skin, a sound I knew well. My face jolted to the right. The sting lasted as it always did, long enough to stand for the verbal lashing that came after. There was no place for slipshod work in this family. No, there was no place for it at all. By the time I was 11, I was a sophomore in high school. I must try harder, be better, abide all disgrace, until I found a way to succeed and prove my worth. But at night, Howie and I had our secrets. In the darkness of his bedroom, he rose, his little sneakers tangling in the sheet. He smiled at me. I've already got my shoes on, I'm ready. I suppressed a laugh and took his hand. We stood stone still and listened for any breaths but our own. Nothing. Let's go, I said, and he laid his small hand in mine, a trust. We crept from the brownstone and onto the empty Bronx streets, the wet garbage odor of the city as pungent as the inside of the subway. The sidewalks, dark rivers, the street lights, small moons, and the looming buildings' protection from the outside world. The city was silent and deceptively safe in the midnight hours. Howie and I were on a quest to visit other animals caged and forced to act civil in a world they didn't understand. The residents of the Bronx Zoo. Within minutes, we arrived at the Fordham Gate and paused, as we always did, to stare silently at the Rockefeller Fountain. 3 tiers of carved marble children sitting in seashells, mermaids supporting them on raised arms or sturdy heads, the great snake trailing up the center pillar, his mouth open to devour. The water slipped down with a rainfall din that subdues our footfalls and whispers. We reached the small hole in the far side of the fence and slipped through. We cherished our secret journeys to the midnight zoo, the parrot house with the multicolored creatures inside, the hippo, Peter the Great, a flying fox, the reptile house. Sneaking out was both our reward for enduring family life and our invisible rebellion. The Bronx River flowed right through the zoo's land. The snake of dark water seemed another living animal, brought from the outside to divide the acreage in half and then escape. And then there was the lion's den, a dark, caged, and forested area. I was drawn there as if those beasts belonged to me or I to them. Sultan, my voice was resonant in the night. Bodan Maid. The pair of Barbary lions ambled forward, placing their great paws on the earth, muscles dangerous and rippling beneath their fur as they approached the bars. A great grace surrounded them, as if they had come to understand their fate and accept it with roaring dignity. Their manes were deep and tangled as a forest. I fell into the endless universe of their large amber eyes as they allowed, even invited me to reach through the iron and wind my fingers into their fur. They'd been tamed beyond their wild nature, and I felt a kinship with them that caused a trembling in my chest. They indulged me with a return gaze, their warm weight pressed into my palm, and I knew that capture had damaged their souls. I'm sorry, I whispered every time. We were meant to be free. There you go. So tell me what y'all want to talk about. Let me check my time. Ooh, I'm like right on the nose. I'm usually not. I usually get carried away. So tell me what y'all want to talk about. Do you have any questions? Oh, I know you do. Yes, ma'am.
I didn't hear, and you may have said it, I just didn't hear it. How did she know about C.S. Lewis?
No, I didn't say. That's a great question. If I said everything, I'd give the whole book away. But that is a great question. So she had read him. My hand's falling asleep. She had read him for years before she had her mystical experience. By the way, she asked how she knew about C.S. Lewis. She had read his work well before she had the mystical experience that caused her to write to him. She had read The Great Divorce. She had read the Screwtape Letters. She had read Mere Christianity. Narnia was not out yet, so she had not read any of that. And he had been on the cover of Time magazine by then, so he was becoming quite famous. This is in the late 40s. And then there's a man named Chad Walsh who wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly called Apostle to the Skeptics. And it was about C.S. Lewis. And he had gone to spend some time with C.S. Lewis in Oxford and written an article about him that she read. So between the work that she had read of his and the articles written about him, so she also used to love to read fantasy. She, like I said, she believed in all the something more only in literature, not in the world. And so she had read C.S. Lewis, a lot of people don't know this, has a science fiction series called Paralandra. And she had read that also. And so she thought, this is someone who knows what he's talking about. This is someone who can answer my questions. And so she wrote to him. And actually the very first letter was from both her and her husband, Bill Gresham, because together they were researching different religions, trying to decide what was real and what wasn't. And once Lewis wrote them back, the back and forth was only between the two of them. So, what else do you want to know? Yes, ma'am.
What was she like as a mother and her relationship with her children?
She was very close to her children. She has 2 boys named Douglas and Davy. Douglas is still living, so I've been able to interview and talk to him. And I asked him one time, because she has been criticized for leaving for a couple months and then going home. And he says he doesn't remember a time that she was not there for him. If he ran to her, even when she was dying and very, very ill, she was always there for him. Very attentive, eye to eye, very loving. Now, Joy was a fiery woman, so, she probably wasn't super cuddly, I would imagine, but she was always very present, he said, always very present for them. Yeah. And what was the second part? What they were like as children, as a mom?
I think that was the question.
Okay.
What was she like as a mother and
That's what he says. I can only get, what he says. And from her letters, I mean, she constantly is talking about them, writing to them, concerned about them, missing them. So almost every letter she writes has something about her sons in them. And I think we have to look where our attention is, and her attention was always on them, which tells me a lot about what kind of mom she was. So, anyone else? Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the pushback that you got at first? Because this is a book that really shows a side of C.S. Lewis, like, that I didn't know. I took a few classes on him in college and feel like I got to know him so much better after reading Becoming Mrs. Lewis. Can you talk about what the fears you might have had in writing this side of him and how it's been received?
So if you didn't hear her question, did everybody hear her question? She asked about writing about this side of him. I couldn't think about that. So when I did think about it, I was paralyzed with anxiety, because we tend to put people like C.S. Lewis on a pedestal and forget that they're human and broken and have had experiences that changed them. And C.S. Lewis, if you didn't know, was once an atheist also. And he had been injured in World War I. And he had gone to a terrible boarding school where he says he was abused. So C.S. Lewis has some very human and broken history behind him also. And I wanted to bring that to the forefront. I wanted you to know him as much as we can on this side of the grave and with imagination as a human being, and not just the genius we see him as, but as a man who struggled and fell in love and tried not to fall in love and fought falling in love. And knew that this wasn't right in certain people's eyes because she was a divorced New York woman. His best friend, who was J.R.R. Tolkien, completely opposed his relationship with Joy because she was a divorced woman who had come from New York to England. And he was like, no, tried to block it. And he didn't even attend her funeral. So Lewis had to overcome a lot of obstacles to even come to his own true truth of his love for her, because he was met with obstacles at every turn also. And I wanted to not make him, staunch Oxford Don, but as a struggling man who was trying to write beautiful work while trying to be real and trying to fight his vulnerability and eventually giving in to his vulnerabilities, which is, of course, when all of us, find love, is when we give in to our vulnerabilities. So yeah, I was scared to death. And if I thought too much about it, I was paralyzed and couldn't write. So I had to know that I was just writing about 2 human beings who were struggling to live in the world. And I have so far been incredibly blessed with people in the C.S. Lewis world saying, yes, you nailed it. So in fact, tonight, if you have nothing to do, or even if you have something to do, cancel it. Because the beloved Terry Linval, who knows way more about C.S. Lewis than I do, I know way more about Joy than he does, and we're going to have a conversation at Galilee tonight. So it's just a little plug, unless you're sick of me, and then don't come. So, who else had a question? I saw a hand over here. Yes, ma'am. So there's two answers to that question. She asked, how long has this book been in the making? There's two answers. One, since I read the Screwtape Letters at 11 years old, and two, for about 5 years since I decided to write it. It required an incredible amount of research. So between the travel and the research and figuring out the right home for it, it was originally about 700 pages long. So, because Joy could be a trilogy, literally. This book could be a trilogy, but who wants to wait 3 books to see them fall in love and get together? And it could be a limited TV series. Anybody here know anyone? Anyway, because her life is so fascinating that there was no way, I never knew what to leave out. So what I did is I made a touchstone for the book. I made a touchstone that was, if it didn't influence their love story and their coming together, it had to go. We have a saying in the writing world, which is kill your darlings. And so there were a lot of chapters on the cutting room floor. In fact, they're doing this little, we're still 4 days or 5 days from publication, so y'all get it early. But online, for people who pre-bought and can show a receipt, we have a thing of goodies that download it, and one of them is a chapter I cut from the book and a letter she wrote him from the book. So there was a lot on the cutting room floor and a lot of years of trying to figure out what part of her story mattered in this transformational journey. So thank you for asking. Anybody else?
What's your writing process?
My writing process is really crazy and kind of all over the place. You could probably guess that by my hair. But I have a morning routine of writing, but I don't have I'm not an outliner. You know, I want to have my kids' pictures by year in a box, and I want to have my clothes by color in the closet, and I want to be an outliner of books. I'm none of those things. So I for my totally fictional books that aren't about real people, but are about fictional characters from my imagination, I just go with the flow. I mean, I end up outlining about halfway, 3/4 of the way through to make sure my story is going where I need it to go. And I never start without answering the question, what does she want? Why does she want it? Why can't she get it? And what are the psychological lies she believes that keeps her from getting it? And I have that when I started writing, but this book was quite different because I needed to get the timeline right. In fact, we have a book club kit that has their life timeline, and I had that, not as pretty as you'll see it, but I had it in note cards all over my office. So I did have to outline their timelines he has 1,200,000 books, and she has 2, but she also has other things she's published. I needed to make sure I had the publications right, the births, deaths, when they met, when her children were born. So I had timelines and outlines before I wrote this book to get the facts straight first. Because I wanted to build with this novel, what I wanted to do was build a skeleton of absolute truth, right? A skeleton that did not waver from the facts that we know. I didn't want to incorporate opinions. I just wanted a skeleton of the facts. So I built that skeleton, then on top of that skeleton, I put an emotional truth, or the emotional truth I felt was real from reading her letters and her work, and most definitely her poetry. So in 2010, 2011, maybe even a little later, 2012, they found a box in the back dusty closet of her best friend, who was named Jean Wakeman. And in that box were 45 love sonnets she wrote to C.S. Lewis. I know, they were recently found. And so those love sonnets build the backbone of this novel. Every chapter starts with a line from her love sonnets. And so I laid that emotional truth on top of the skeleton of facts. And then the rest had to be imagined because they didn't have a stenographer following them around. So, yeah, exactly. There's not even a lot of photos, honestly. So, do I need to stop talking? Is that what you're telling me? Okay. Well, first, before you come up here, I want to say thank you so much for having me. Y'all are an amazing group, and I want to get together with the women who started this and tell you need to make this prototype and carry it to all the cities. This is simply amazing. Bring it to Birmingham, where I live. Thank you so much for having me.